anytime I talk about creativity, it always starts with my father, Jack Bahler, who was a self-taught trumpet player in Missouri, got on the road, was a good player, and in his 20s went to Juilliard and studied with the greatest trumpet player ever, teacher ever, Max Schlossberg. And then he came to Los Angeles and played in the studios, and that's where I was raised. And by the time I came along, Dad was tired of playing the trumpet in for money. He just loved playing trumpet. I mean, he'd pick up a gig every now and then just for fun. But he didn't want to do it as a job. So he and my grandfather started a jukebox route. And we had jukeboxes from Long Beach to Santa Monica, 54 different places. They call them spots. And so we were warehousing over 5,000 records. And so Dad thought, well, why not put a storefront up and serve the community? So we had Fifth Avenue Music, which is not Fifth Avenue, New York. It's Fifth Avenue, Inglewood, a little different. And it was fun for my brother and I growing up because we would give Dad a list of songs that we wanted and records, and he would bring them home. But he would also always add something that he wanted to maybe introduce us to, like jazz at the Philharmonic or the Planet Suite by Gustav Holst, you know? Great stuff. Mm-hmm. And he would also bring surprises. And one of my favorite, warmest memories, actually, as a little boy, was Dad sent home this Reader record, which was an album of four 12-inch 78s, so they're on both sides. And there are pictures that are illustrations that are done by the cartoon artists. Mm-hmm. And it was about Warner Brothers characters, and so the voices were all done by Mel Blanc. And it was great, and they were all classic stories. First one Dad brought home was called Bugs Bunny and the Tortoise. Excuse me. The first one he brought home was Bugs Bunny and the Tortoise. And because Bugs was the star, Bugs won by an ear. Same story, though, you know, where the rabbit gets so far ahead, he goes, yeah, right. And the tortoise just keeps hitting it. Well, when Dad got home, I said, Dad, I love this story. It's my favorite story. And he says, well, I'm glad you like it, son. It's not a new story. I said, really? He said, no, it's at least 2,500 years old. And I said, wait a minute, Bugs Bunny isn't that old. And he said, no, Bugs isn't, but the story is. So I fell in love with Aesop's Fables, and Dad would bring home books of Aesop's Fables that were illustrated, and we would go through them and talk about why they were important and why they were still being quoted after all of this time. Mm-hmm. And what I learned at a very young age is that Aesop wrote about human nature. And human nature hasn't changed since the caves. Mm-hmm. And as you know, we are all born sans wisdom. So I had discussions with my father at a very young age about the fables. And they were stories that made sense to me. And then he also told me that, you know, these were not written for children. These were primers of nations. I said, really? He says, yeah, but this is the wealth of them, is that they're understood globally, and they're understood by all ages. Why? Because it's human nature, and each of us has these feelings, these decisions to make. The Boy Who Cried Wolf is such a simple story about a little shepherd boy who's lonely. So he decides to crawl wolf so people will come and visit him. And then when they find out there's no wolf, they're not happy. And he does it a couple of times and they come running to him. So finally they just ignore him. And when there is a wolf, they don't come. And the flock is destroyed. What a simple story. But it also tells us that if we lie, people won't believe us when we tell the truth. And that is a tenet that each of us, it serves every human being on the planet. Doesn't matter where you're from, what language you speak, your gender, your beliefs. It's just human nature. And this is what Aesop wrote too, and this is what I love so much. Now, my dad was a great trumpet player, and on Tuesday nights we had musicians who would come over to our house. And Dad had a couple of small bandstands that we put the music on, and I was so proud because My brother and I got interested in music because we saw this look in Dad's eyes that he only got when he was playing music. And it was such a look of passion. We wanted some of that. And so we told Dad, we want to play too. And he says, well, that's fine, boys. With every opportunity, there is an equal responsibility. So if you want to play the trumpet, I think that'll be great. But you're going to need to practice 10 minutes a day. We said, okay. So we did. And then it grew, So it was always so much fun with Dad. It was never do this, do that. So I learned how to read and write music before I learned how to read and write English because I wanted to, because it was fun. And I loved the visual support to listen to a record and to look at a score. Even as a little guy, I couldn't read it all, but I could follow the trumpet part, So this one night, we're sitting in our living room, and I'm sitting right next to my dad, and they're playing Gershwin's Lady Be Good. It's only about 4 guys, a guitar player and my dad and trumpet, and this guy played an electric squeeze box. It was so cool. And I'm following right along, and I'm so proud of myself because I can see this. I know where it's going, and that's a half note, and that's, and it was so cool. And all of a sudden, Dad starts playing music that isn't on the paper. And I'm like, look up at Dad, and he looks down, and he sees me, and he just winks. So later on, I said, Dad, what were you doing? He said, oh, I was improvising. I said, what's that? He said, that's when you let the music take you. And I said, is that creative? And he said, yeah, it is. So fast forward some time, not too long, maybe a year or two. One day I said, Dad, okay, how do you create? And he said, I'll tell you how I do it. And I love that about my dad because he never said this is the way. In fact, he used to say, if someone says this is the way, run the other way. So he says, okay, I'll tell you how I do it. I declare what I want, and I let it go. And I was about 6, and I'm like, And he says, let me explain, son. When you decide what you want, you send out an energy. And if that, what you want, serves others as well, more than likely, you're going to get it. Really? He says, that's been my experience. And he says, but here's the thing. Once you declare what you want and let it go, then you keep your eyes peeled, as he would say. You're vigilant. And he said, because when that idea comes to you, you may not recognize it at first, because if you did, it would not be new. And at 6, I got that. And it was so cool. And he says, then you must be a good host. He says, when your buddy Georgie comes over, you're always throwing him an apple or a banana. Well, that's what you do with the idea. When it comes to you, you invite it inside, and you throw it an apple or a banana, and you're a good host. Well, if that idea is supposed to stay with you, it will become a part of you. And if it isn't, it will leave happily and tell other ideas it's found a good host. Now, I learned that at 6 years old. So I learned how to create in such a fun, non-painful, non-suffering way. And then later on, I remember Dad, we were talking about creating, and he said, son, creating is listening. He said, if something occurs to you, he believed that there were no random thoughts. If something occurs to you, it has value. If it occurs to you more than once, it has more value. And if it occurs to you more than twice, write it down. So I did that. But I remember him saying all the time, write it down, son, write it down. I said, I've been thinking. He says, write it down. And it was a great habit to get into, just little notes. My dad had notes everywhere. And so creating was fun. It was not even a challenge. It was an adventure. And when I decided I wanted to write my first musical arrangement, and I said, Dad, I want to write an arrangement. And he says, well, you know the clefs. Bass clef, treble clef. He said, that's probably a good way to start. And I said, well, I hear this bass line. He says, write it down. And he says, do you hear it all the way through the song? And I said, yeah, pretty much. He said, write down everything that you hear on that bass line. Now, go back and look at that and just think about a piano. And I heard a piano part. All I had to do was focus on that instrument. And it was so thrilling, Phil. The first time I heard my band play this chart, it was such a validation because it sounded exactly like it sounded in my head. And I was hearing it from other people. And it was just so extraordinary. So creating was always wonderful. And so when I started writing songs, I wrote what I heard. And every piece of music I've ever composed, I've written what I hear. Sometimes it comes to me, a good friend of mine, and we were doing a major thing over in World's Fair. And he had a son who was unfortunately born with an expiration date. And he was an amazing little boy. And as he was telling me his story, I heard these melodies. I can write music on I've written hits on napkins, you know. I wrote, and that ended up being the themes for this big show we did. And it was the #1 event in the 1990 World's Fair in Osaka. And we knew it was spiritually driven. And so that's kind of the way I've lived my life. So fast forward to this guy. I'm in my early 30s. I bought my first home. It was Ann Sheridan's home. I don't know if you've heard of Ann Sheridan, but she was called the Oomph Girl. She was not only beautiful, she always played strong roles. You know, she was wonderful. And she had passed away, and I bought the house out of her estate. And it had a library, a good-sized library, you know, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, shelves. Not a thing on it. And I own 3 books. Why? Because I'm the kind of guy that I would read this and say, Phil, you're going to love this. Here, take this. So I started filling the shelves with subscriptions. I was single at the time, but I knew that I'd have kids one day. So I got the classics. And as they came in, I put them in 3 categories. I will read this. I have read this. I will never read this. But I read the preface of everything. And it was so much fun. I learned so much. Well, when Aesop's Fables came in, I was filled with those wonderful memories. Now, my dad was still with us, but I was filled with those. In fact, I remember calling him and saying, Dad, you'll never guess what I got. So I looked at the preface of that, and it said, although Aesop was born in 620 BC a slave with no access to wealth or influence, later in his life, he served as ambassador to King Croesus of Lydia, who was then the most powerful and wealthiest man in the world. You may have heard the term rich as Croesus. And we say, how wealthy is he? Well, he's rich as Croesus. Well, I asked a question that transformed my life. And that question was, how did he do that? And the instant I asked that question, I felt a rush of energy go through me. And it was like a chill, but it was not cold. And from that moment on, I thought about Aesop every day. And I was in the studio with Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones, and I had a song on the album. I was associate producer on the album, and I would pick up Quincy every day. Quincy does not drive. That's a great story in itself. But I would pick him up, and we're driving, and I said, hey, man, I got to tell you what happened last night. I was looking at this thing, and I got this feeling, man, and Aesop moved in with me. I've been thinking about him ever since. And he says, Nad, listen to that. That's important. So here he is backing up my dad. Well, within 2 weeks of reading that preface, I got a call from Radio City Music Hall to come be their creative director. And while it was enticing, I was in the studio, and I finished what I start. But when I told Quincy what happened, he said, get your booty to New York. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for you. You must take it. I said, okay, but we're producing. He says, I produced before you, I'll produce after you. I'll be fine. So I went to New York. We did the show at Radio City. It was a big hit. And the second once-in-a-lifetime opportunity happened. Within weeks of our opening, I got a call from the most powerful man on Broadway in terms of music publishing. He had Sondheim, Kander and Ebb, Harnick and Bach. I mean, this guy was the guy. And he had heard some of my music, and he said, I think you have a knack for the theater, kid. I said, thank you. He said, do you have any ideas for a show? And I said, well, tell you the truth, this guy Aesop has moved in with me. I'm still thinking about him all the time and thinking about the fables and why did he write them? I wonder what happened in his life, you know? And Tommy says, this is great. I'll tell you what, you give me a year, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day in the libraries of New York, studying Aesop, and I will shepherd you through the process of writing this as a musical. I said, well, I just got to New York. I'm creative director of Radio City Music Hall. And he said, it's up to you. So go back. Bob Yanni, who's my president and friend, says, how was your talk with Tommy? And I said, well, this is what he said. And he says, get out of here. This is a once-in-a-lifetime offer. Tommy doesn't do this. I've never heard of him doing this. You need to go. So I was kicked out of the nest twice within 4 months. So I spent all of that time studying, and the story started coming to me. And I listened, and I wrote it down. The first people to hear it were the two biggest producers on Broadway. One loved my music, one loved my story. Neither were buying. And I was confused. Then I met my wife. And I forgot about Aesop. And I returned to LA, started raising a family, and returned into the production of music, which I've been doing full force, but now even bigger because I've been a creative director, so we added that on. So I was having a wonderful time in my life. It was great. And that went on for 17 years, and then as life would have it, I found myself a single man. And I was living in a club downtown, grieving for my family, and one day as I was looking out the window, wondering where I was going to pour my passion, I felt Aesop's presence. I can't explain it, but he was there. And I heard, remember me?
Came back home again.
Yeah. He said, let's go to work. So from that moment, I turned out 3 different musicals. I did it 3 different ways. Then Carl Reiner heard it, and he said, oh my God, this is such a great story. You need to do this as an opera. I went, okay. So I wrote it as an opera. The comments were the same throughout, and it started back with Hal Prince. Too much story for the medium. I'm so confused. But I like your story. So I had a buddy who's a Broadway writer, and I went to him and I said, would you help me? And he said, yeah, I'll help you. I'll tell you this. You need to write it as a novel. I said, but I've never written a novel. And he said, there was a time when you had not written music. That was the key. So I began to write, and pretty soon Aesop took over. And I was taking dictation once again. And this story flowed out of me, and it's been a work of passion and love. And I hope it is for my readers too.
So, one question I have is, I'm interested in, you mentioned, where you said that listening, or creativity is listening.
Mm-hmm.
How much do you see creativity, if creativity is listening, how much of that listening is related to compassion, to empathy, to yourself? Like if listening, when you say listening, you mean listening to the universe or listening to the thoughts that are coming?
I'm listening to, and to me they're not thoughts, because thoughts is my male brain.
Right.
That's you have a meeting this afternoon. And my heart is the feminine in me. Mm-hmm. In fact, I had a fight with this, because when I decided to write it as a novel, mm-hmm. the little guy sits over here with the red suit and the pointed tail said, you don't know how to write a novel. What the hell are you doing? Stick to what you know. And then the beautiful little girl in white with the wings said, why not? And I made a discovery I'm going to share with you because it was, for me, it was a pivotal moment. There was a battle between those two, always has been. I think it is for all of us. And whether it's a battle or just coexistence or what, there's always those two things going on. And at one point, somehow, I realized, wait, I'm not my mind and I'm not my heart. I'm me. They work for me. So I was able to move forward with this by quieting my mind, and the way that I did it was with respect. I said to my mind, as it was saying, you don't know what you're doing, you're going to fail, people are going to laugh at you. I said, thank you for your input, like I would to a board of directors. And then I turned to my angel and said, let's hit it. And that's how the book was born. And the thing is, there was such freedom in that. And so listening is not necessarily with my ears. It's just being aware, and what Dad taught me, be vigilant. And the thing is, I wrote a lot of commercials. And commercials, I don't get that inspired about writing a Ford commercial. But I found something that was inspiring. I looked for the inspiration in whatever it was I was doing. That excited me, that honestly excited me. And that's what I would focus on. And a lot of times it was just serving the client who said, this is what I want. Another great thing Dad taught me. I remember calling him and saying, Dad, what the client wants, I think is totally wrong. And it's really hard for me to get excited about this. And he said, son, give them what they want. They're paying you. You give them what they want. Then give them what you want. Give them what they want. Then you say, oh, by the way, I heard it a different way too. And then, if you have time, write it part what they want and part what you want. And you know what? That was the one that got bought more than anything. But the thing is, the client was knocked out because I didn't bring in one thing. I brought in three.
So you mentioned, that's fantastic. I love that. You mentioned that Aesop came to you early in
Yes.
life and kind of stayed with you for a long time, and kind of came back. How do you see Aesop's parables, his stories? How did you think it influenced your work, your creative work?
Well, when I really started studying, when I realized the genius of the fable, and Aesop created the fable. A fable is a short, simple story in which the listener discovers and owns the meaning. So they discover it, like the boy who cried wolf. About halfway through that, you go, I know where this is going. I know what this is. And you own it. You're excited because you discovered it. I didn't say, if you lie, people won't believe you when you tell the truth. There's something in you that's going to say, shut up, in all of us. When somebody comes and tells us, but if I tell you that story, it registers with you. And you'll keep that with you. And this is why 2,600 years ago, this dude left the planet, and we still quote him over 1 million times a day all over the world. He's the only author that we do that with. Why? Because he wrote about human nature, and he wrote it in a way that was so full of wisdom. And the thing is, when Aesop was born on the island of Samos, in that region of the world, this is when philosophy was being born. And a lot of philosophy with Pythagoras and different people of that nature. I had a wonderful teacher who taught Quincy Jones and Randy Newman and a bunch of his name was George Tremblay. And he said, it takes talent to recognize genius. And what Aesop was hearing from these guys was great, but you had to be erudite to understand what they were talking about. Aesop took those same ideas and gave them to us in this, in his fables. And this, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is not the fables. What it is his life story. His life story came to me, and how he wove the fables into into getting what he wanted.
And how much?
And what he wanted was freedom, because he was already serving people as a slave.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't mind serving people, but it was so limiting. He said, if I'm free, I can serve them way better. And he did. And that's his journey.
That's very interesting. I mean, how much of his life story was already known, or
Just about bupkis. There was a book written about him. It's actually called the first novel. And there is a professor at Oxford who postulates that that story of Aesop is the basis of the Gospels. Not with their message, but how it was written. Because this is the first story of its kind, and it's a hero's journey. And it's called The Life of Aesop. And it's very short. And when I discovered that, I was thrilled because I thought, oh, great, my work's done for me. No, it wasn't at all. Because the Aesop, and now it was written 200 years after his death. So who knows, and nobody knows who wrote it. But the Aesop in that book was a plotter. And as I read these fables, I don't get somebody who's plotting. I get somebody who's got a very imaginative mind, but that loves people. And so his character formed. And I almost feel like I was put here to straighten out the history, you know? And in no self-aggrandizing manner. It's just, but this has been my purpose in life since I was in my early 30s, man. And I've put it away many times, and I've gone and done other things, but everything I do leads me back to him. And now, after I finished the book, my best friend and business partner read it. He was the first one to read it, and he said, I love this book, but why did you have to kill him? And I said, well, it's his life story. You're born, you live, you die. And he said, I wish you'd write another ending. And I said, why? He says, because I smell more books. I don't think you're through. So, again, that was input, right? Write another story. So, because Chase is a man of few words, and he's so wise and so trustworthy, I said, well, Chase, you know, when you speak, I listen, so I'm going to invite that. I let it go. And one morning, 3 weeks later, I woke up with a new ending that was better. And not only that, it gave us, as soon as the new ending was in, the second story took off. And the next book, which is almost finished, by the way.
Oh.
And it'll be a trilogy.
Okay.
The next book is called For Love of a Woman. And it takes, and it's more the story, Aesop's very much in it, and his wisdom is a part of it. But it's very much the story of the heroine, whose name is Dione, and the antagonist, whose name is Hyksos. He's the son of the Egyptian king. And there is a lot of history in this, and where there is history, I was very certain it had a lot of help from great Greek professors. And I don't mean American professors that taught Greek. These were Greeks that taught in Athens. We made sure that the incidents of history are true. For instance, Croesus, who is the king of Lydia, and he is the most powerful man, is a good friend of Amasis, who is the king of Egypt. So all of those things play into my story, but my story is fictional.
So what were some of your favorite fables or kind of nuggets of wisdom from Aesop?
Well, the one that comes to mind is when Croesus, as I said, was so powerful, and Samos was the nest of philosophy. And one of the reasons it was, in fact, the main reason it was, is because it was the greatest shipping port in the world. It was the gateway to the east for the west, the gateway to the west for the east. So there were ships from all over the world. And this is really the first time that this had happened. So you had all of these different cultures coming together, and they were in there for months. They didn't go in and pack it up and leave. They were in there for months, and they shared stories. And as they shared stories, they'd be like, and philosophy just started rising on its own. So it was really born of merchants. And Samos was never really attacked by anyone because it was such a trading post that if one country attacked them, the other countries were going to get mad and go after them. So it was really a pretty safe place. Well, suddenly, Croesus decided to tax them. And they were like, what? You can't do that. And he says, oh, yes, I can. He was that bad. He was a bad ass. So they asked Aesop, because he was really the wisest man there, if he would go and argue their case to Croesus. And he said, you're sending me to my death, but I'll do it. So he went before Croesus, and when Croesus saw that Samos had sent a slave to negotiate with him, he blew it. Take this remnant out and dispose of it. And Aesop basically said, well, you can do that, you're the king, but I bring you good news. How can the king not say, what is it? He says, what is it? He said, well, I'm going to offer you a story. And if you see no good in it, dispose of me as you wish. And you asked me about my favorite fable. My personal favorite is this one. It was about the lion and the mouse. The lion's asleep in the forest. The little mice are running around, and one mouse doesn't realize he's running over the king. And he happens to hit one of his whiskers, and the lion wakes up and puts his paw down on the mouse. And the mouse crawls out from under. He says, you're the king, I'm a mouse. If you kill me, it will mean nothing. And I'm not a sufficient snack for you. So if in your kindness you will let me go, maybe I can help you one day. And the lion says, how can a smidge like you ever help a king like me? And the little mouse said, well, you'll never know unless you let me go. So he says, okay, fine, get out of here before I change my mind and use you for a toothpick. And as the little mouse ran off, he said, you'll never regret this. Well, not long after that, the mouse heard the roar of the lion, but it wasn't a roar of power. It was a roar of fear. And he went to the source, and there was the lion, hopelessly ensnared in a hunter's net. And the little mouse walked up to the lion and said, remember me? The lion said, yes. Not long after that, the mouse heard the roar of the lion, but it was not a roar of power. It was a roar of fear. So he ran to the source, and there was the lion, hopelessly ensnared in a hunter's net. And the little mouse walked up to the lion and said, remember me? And the lion said, yes. And the mouse gnawed him free. What a story.
It's amazing because I was going to say it is so, his metaphors are so clear. They're so clear and powerful about, it's absolutely discussing the relationship of power and the powerless. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing that he wrote that clearly.
And he did most of these extemporaneously. And it saved his life. Because the king said, I understand what you're saying. What do you want? And he said, leave the Samians alone. He said, I can't. I need money. There were riddle contests back then, and Croesus was losing his fanny. So he had to tax somebody to get the money. And that's all in the book, and it's riddles were used for those kind of things. But anyway, yeah, he saw things very clearly, and he also used animals because they are non-threatening. Mm-hmm. And their wisdom, again, it's human nature. And the quote that's come from that is, no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted.
Is ever
wasted.
It was ever wasted.
Yeah. So, you're talking about wisdom. Certainly, Western culture wisdom was born at this time of Aesop's life, and I think Aesop delivered it in a way that has lasted the longest, because if you read Pythagoras, he's still very interesting, but we don't quote him. You know?
Right.
And they saw things in a very complicated manner. Just like you just said, Phil, he makes it so concise, so simple. And this is why children love them. But also, kings were children, because you didn't go to a king and give him something complicated to think about. His life was complicated enough. And Aesop saw that. And he was able to control situations while still a slave. And this was part of his freedom, because he finally gains his freedom, and he becomes the ambassador to Croesus. Croesus was a great king. He's the first king to assemble a board of advisors. He was the first king to understand that he didn't know it all. So he got great people around him, and he didn't care where they came from. He had no borders there. And that's why Aesop, actually, when he started with him, was a slave. But he says, come in here and tell us what you think. And he had Solon, who created the jury system. And he had these great people. In fact, Solon said there was a gathering of the 8 sages of Greece, and Aesop was invited. And when they left, they said, he's the best of us all. And in Lysippus, in about 200 BC, they did a wonderful, in Athens, they did Lysippus was the leading sculptor. And he did a beautiful half moon with the 8 sages of Greece. And right in the middle of them, as if he were conducting, was Aesop. And the thing is, we've lost sight of how great he was, because we think that he writes for children. Well, he writes well enough that children understand, just like my dad explained creativity to me in a way. And that was one of my tenets in writing this book. My readership, my readership goes from 10 years old to heaven. I have a beautiful letter from Janet Gary, who is the daughter of Eddie Cantor. She is now in her 90s. She read the book, sent me the most beautiful letter, and said, I love your book. I love the way the fables are weaved into it. It reminds me so much of my father, who came to this country a little guy with nothing, and he became one of the biggest stars of the century, And the lost generation, people in their 20s that were promised, right?
Right.
They are my most vocal readership, and I get a lot of messages from them saying, I've been so disappointed, in so many ways, and this book gives me hope. So the Under Anything is Possible, it says inspiration from yesterday, for today, and forever. Because the inspiration that we gain from him will not change, because human nature won't change. And as we were talking about wisdom, we're all born without wisdom, and we glean it as we go along. And this is why he has been so important in our lives. And for me, it was a privilege to write a story. I had a review the other day that says, I don't like this book because I have other things to do and I can't put it down. I said, yes. But I get a lot of that, is that it's not that long. It's only about 190 pages, but people seem to get into the story. And
well, I can tell you, I'm definitely, I can't wait to get into it. And my nephew, who is 10, is his biggest passion in life. It actually is to be a stand-up comedian and into classics. He loves mythology, everything mythology. So
Wonderful.
He is gonna love this book.
Wonderful,
And,
yeah. Well, I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah.
And I would love, a lot of my readers talk to me, call me, and I welcome you. I get, on Facebook and Twitter, all of those things, Thomas Bahler, and it's wonderful, the conversations that I had a reader in Syria. And when we first launched the book, before we did the illustrated edition, we hooked up with a company called Self Growth, and they are worldwide. And so we were put all over the world in our first outing. And we picked up readers everywhere, and what we did, we had let them read the first couple of chapters, and this gal writes me on Facebook from Syria, name is Nagam Mala, and she writes me and says, "Okay, I'm hooked. Where can I get this book?" I said, "Well, you can get it from Amazon." She goes, "Not in Syria." I said, "Well, okay," and she was so hungry. I said, "I'll tell you what, Naga, it'll be my gift. I'll send you a book." She said, "Thank you, but we don't take mail from the United States." And I said, "Okay." Everything I offered, it was like, no, no, no. And I said, "Okay, remember the title of the book. You figure it out. You get back to me, and I'll send you a book." About a week later, she said, "Okay, I got it. I live in Damascus. You can send it." I called Federal Express, because Federal Express won't deliver to Syria from the States either. So she said, "If you send it to my name, in care of Federal Express in Lebanon, Beirut, it's a 2-hour drive for me, and I'll drive to pick up the book." I said, "Okay." So I sent it, and I didn't hear from her for a while. And then she writes me this kind of sheepish letter, and she said, "Well, the first time I went, I forgot to call and they were closed." So she drove 4 hours, didn't get it. Second time she got it, and she said, "It's 2:30 in the morning. I have to get up at 6:30, and I can't put this book down." And she wrote me a letter and said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, especially what my country's going through right now." She said, "This book keeps me afloat." So these are the kind of letters that I get from my readers, and it makes me happy because I'm here to serve. There is very little of my ego in this book, but there is a lot of my heart. And it's what I've learned from my father, what I've learned in life. I've had some of the best mentors on the planet, Robert F. Yanni, who created all of the entertainment at Disneyland, including the Electric Light Parade. Brilliant man, who brought me to Radio City. Quincy Jones, who is the most intelligent person I've ever met in my life, and also the nicest, most compassionate. And George Tremblay, who I mentioned earlier, who taught Quincy and who also taught Randy Newman and Pat Williams, so many of us. So I've had great mentors, and what I found is when you are mentored, you mentor others. You pay it forward. And part of that is in this book. So I didn't read it, I didn't write it with any intent. I listened to what came to me.
Well, it's such a powerful title too. Anything is possible, and I think it, it just it absolutely grabs you in. I'm curious about because you've studied fable, you studied very much, how you see a correlation or analogy between the construct of fable and composing and the stories that happen in music, and the does one feed into another, or do they speak to each other in any way? Or
I think they speak with and to each other in myriad ways. And it all has to do with form. I mean, a story isn't a story without a form. There's an exposition and a development and a recapitulation. And this is the symphonic form. It's also used in jazz. Well, that's not exactly the way stories go, but you start a story off with something that's interesting. If I talk about a lion and a mouse, there's a great contrast there. So you go, oh, what? And then you find out, then you get into the development of the story, where the lion's going to kill you. Is this guy going to get killed? What is he? It's a ballsy mouse to say, "Let me go," And then it gets to the point that he says, "I'll never forget this," and you think, well, I know this isn't the end. And then he comes back and he saves him. He does what he said he would do. He kept his word, and he was proud of himself, and he saved his king. So this is what music does. And I think that there's form to everything, and storytelling is a form. And before the industrial age, all learning was done through storytelling. Again, it's a longer form of the fable, because in stories you learn, you glean what works for you. If I were to tell you the story of Columbus coming to America, if I were to tell you the story of Muhammad or Christ or, Buddha, these are stories about gifted men who gave us things that we still use, because the truth is always the truth. And I'm not talking about religious dogma, but the truth is, if you lie, people won't believe you when you tell the truth. I mean, that's just the truth. Doesn't matter what religion, creed, or anything you're in. That's just, those are given facts. So that's the way that knowledge was passed along. And it was originally passed along in verse because it was easier to remember. And this is before, even though the written word has been around since the Assyrians, it was mostly for the town or the city and up on buildings and things. There wasn't that much writing going on because they really didn't need to. They talked their stories and still do.
Absolutely. No, it's all. I mean, it's so interesting, especially. I mean, certainly from the concept of wisdom. I mean, just curious. So, I mean, we talked about it a little bit before, but I mean, are you still hoping or working on a translation into a musical?
Yeah, I think my ultimate goal with this story is a musical. And now that we have it in a novel form, there are different kinds of writers. Somebody's going to take this and do a wine reduction of it into a story that works in the small story space that you have in a musical. And I believe that that'll happen. I won't be the guy to do it. That's a special writer that does that. I'm a storyteller. I just keep telling my stories. And I do it when I'm playing my horn. I still play my horn. I sit in with Cat Gang, who's this wonderful jazz singer at the Plaza Hotel, and on Wednesday nights, I literally sit in. I don't want to stand up with the band. I sit in a chair and play my flugelhorn. And it is so much fun because that is something that I've been expressing myself since I was 5 years old. And so when I'm doing that, there's this home in it. And everything that we express, if it's understood by others, has form. And and we're sharing wisdom with how we feel, and all of a sudden goes, yeah, I felt that way. Whoa, I'm not alone. Or that somebody learns something and goes, yeah, thank you. I don't have to go through that. I just learned it from you. But it's so much different than being in the classroom and doing all of that industrial age learning, because it doesn't stay with us. In fact, Benjamin Franklin said, teach me and I'll forget. Show me, I might remember. Engage me, it's with me for life. And that's the way things were done. If you were interested in horseshoeing, you were an apprentice and you hung out with the best guy and you watched him, and then you say, let me try. Or he'll say, give it a try. Oh yeah, okay, see, now watch this. Let me watch it again. He wouldn't say you're wrong, or I mean, who knows how he does it, but basically, it was being engaged. You're part of a human interchange, and that's what we're doing right now. Is we're talking and we're sharing it with others. Yeah. But it's the interchange that's important. You're bringing things out of me, and I'm bringing things out of you. Yep. And I love that.
That's the beauty of it.
Another thing my dad taught me, excuse me, this just came up.
Yeah.
I remember the kids at school starting to talk about this girl and I, and we're like 9 or 10 years old. But we'd been friends for so long, she would jump on my lap, I'd pull her hair. It was like we were buddies, but she happened to be the most beautiful girl in school. So we got to that age where we're starting to look at him differently. I didn't notice how beautiful she was. Somebody had to point it out to me. And so now these stories started going around that Manette and I were, a couple at 9, please. that was irritating. But what bothered me is that this is the first time I heard my friends lie, telling lies, stories that had no basis, no foundation of truth. And before that, it was exaggeration. We all do that. So, and it really bothered me. So at dinner, my dad was amazing. He says, "Tommy, are you okay?" And I said, "No." "What's the matter?" I said, "Dad, they're telling lies about me and Manette, and it really upsets me because these are lies." And he said, "Son, what other people think of you is none of your business." And even at night, it was like, "Woof, okay, I'm free." And he said, "Think about it. You cannot control others' thoughts. So put your energy in those things that you do control." I said, "Well, let's see, what is that?" And we got into let's talk about that. And what made me think about this? I said, "Well, I'm controlling this conversation." My dad said, "No, you're not. You're controlling your half of it." But that's a good start. Keep thinking, keep thinking. So finally, it boiled down to me that the only thing that I control is my own integrity. I have absolute control over that. And this is what Aesop found too. And there's freedom in that. Even though he was a slave, he knew that in his mind he was free. Now he had to prove it to the rest of the world, and he did. But if he didn't know that he was free, even when he was a slave, chances are he would have never been free.
I love that.